All right, so today we are going to finalize on our journey of Christian astrology. And we're going to attempt to bring it all together with a Jungian psychological twist, right? So, fun. But just a short recap, we began this journey. Make sure this is on. We began this journey speaking about Abraham's father. Okay, his name is Terah, and he was leading to go to Canaan, remember? So heading towards Canaan, which means heading towards the lowlands. And the fact that the Chaldeans were known to be astrologers helps us determine that Terah was moving from a certain kind of conscious perspective, all right? So being fixated on that physical source of light. And then moving towards the lowlands would be what allowed him to see the spiritual or the inner light, okay? And what that was actually revealing. And we use the example of the morning star, right? This is also the idea of Lucifer because that's what the morning star is, or that's what Lucifer means, is morning star. We use that to explain the difference between focusing on the source of light rather than focusing on what that source of light is trying to show us. Since the morning star is often known as the planet Venus, and it must give away and disappear to the light of the rising sun. Okay? And the point is, as we explained, the biblical text tries to explain to us in several accounts that we should look to the east or look to the source, which would be that sun, and then turn towards the west and then travel in the direction in which the light is trying to show us. And therefore, this process is basically explaining how to break free from a stagnant ego conscious, which would be idyllic in nature, right? And this was presented in the city of Haran, where Terah settled. So in other words, focusing on the source rather than what the source is trying to show us or allow us to see, gives acknowledgement to the source, okay? But however, the question is, what then still remains behind us, okay? So what would remain westward? It would be everything that we're not looking at, all right? Everything that we're not seeing, and therefore a very large unseen shadow. That is, of course, until we turn ourselves around and we take notice to everything which we were ignoring, okay? And then by traveling west is to bring that light into the lowlands, okay? Is to bring that light into the unconscious, awakening our conscious understanding to what we haven't been paying attention to in our lives, giving attention and recognizing that undeveloped parts of our personality, and confronting the limited perspectives, right? Building bridges between what is known in our world and what is unknown to us. And therefore bringing light to those shadows. Ultimately, we are then bringing heaven to earth, okay? And thus allowing more and more light to fill the lowlands of what we previously did not see, which would be the people maybe that we've oppressed, or the things, the wrong pathways in which we've been wandering down. So now the idea of bringing heaven to earth brings us into the procession of ages, right? And these are the four main astrological equinoxes which happen to be within our current evolutionary epoch. That's these guys. So in other words, these are the particular constellations that sit directly behind the sun whenever the sun is perfectly aligned with the Earth's equator. And because the Earth wobbles as it orbits around, which is quite fitting that it's wobbling, right? Because it seems like everything is to some degree. These constellations slowly change their positions from one being behind the sun to another. And this is, of course, this shift happens within several thousand years. And as the ancients intuitively prophesied, these time brackets would reflect the conscious evolution of the human condition, making each era or age of human civilization in a whole reflect the essence of the particular constellation that was presently aligned. And surprisingly, their presumptions in many written accounts seem to be pretty accurate. So I don't know what to say about that, but it seems to hold out more often than not. I do believe, however, that there is sort of a good reason for this, okay? Certain individuals who would have been, like, let's say, psychologically or spiritually aware, right, would have had an intuition enough to pick up on what conscious evolution is as a whole. And in this sense, because they themselves were fortunate enough to experience and realize the entirety of these shifts, or at least the principal idea of the shifts, but within their singular lifetime. So, in other words, they must have experienced the conscious awakening from Taurus to Aries, right? From instinct to intellect. And they would have become self-aware of the conflicting tension of balancing these two natures when it brings us to that constellation of Pisces, right? The fish that are swimming in opposite directions. Since this reveals those two natures, right? Those two tensions. And this is why Christ would then represent Pisces. So Christ was always seen as the fish, right? And this would reflect his nature of being those two natures, both fully God and fully man, or fully divine and fully man, symbolizing the perfect balance and pulling together those indifferences. And they would have had a deep sense that such a balance, like what was found in Christ, could be possible, at least to some degree, within a personal level, okay? They would have sensed that the physical nature of things and the heavenly intellect, so our flesh and our mind, could align and complement each other perfectly, even if that time they themselves had not reached that level of inner balance and awareness. They kind of sensed it, they kind of knew that it was there. And therefore, the procession of ages appears to be a process of conscious awareness and maturation. An awareness and a growth that can happen on an individual level, or an awareness and a growth that happens, of course, on a collective level. So the micro and the macro, right? And what I'm going to attempt to do today is to weave the biblical inference of this process. And I'm going to try to bring this in on a symbolic or a spiritual level, as well as connecting the psychological aspects of this also, and particularly, of course, Jungian psychology. So I'm going to attempt to do this in such a way where this all makes sense on as much of a practical level as I can, as well as on a spiritual level, right? So that shouldn't be too difficult, right? But this is so this sometimes, like, I ask myself why I am tempted, right, to do the most difficult and complicated tasks like this, okay? And I really don't know how to answer that question. I don't know why I am drawn to these things. Although, all I know is that I am drawn to them in a very powerful way, okay? And because of that, this is my humble disclosure to you guys. I am not a scholar by any means, at least maybe one day I will, but not currently. And it's not clear to me just how much authority that I really have to speak on these kind of matters, okay? But what I do know is that I work very, very hard to try to understand these concepts, and as deep of a level as I possibly can try to understand them. And then I present them, or at least what I can understand about them, in as clear a way as I possibly know how to do. So in many ways, I've had to see myself as a fool, because I'm foolish enough to speak on matters that have remained on the very edge of human understanding. And who am I necessarily to do so? I'm sure to get a lot of the things wrong while I'm trying to do this, right? Or in the least, I'm going to miss some details here and there. But I suppose that if I could give myself any kind of positive credit, I keep a courageous heart in some sense, that I know that I may be pushing the margins of what I know to the point where I may be made full of. Yeah, but so be it, right? That's the way I look at it. Because I also know that if we don't try to push these margins, there may be no hope in discovering something new, or at least something that has been lost from our ancient fathers from way back when. And we no longer understand what they mean in our current age. So it's important to know that the things that I'm speaking of are not necessarily supported by biblical academics necessarily, at least probably in the evangelical setting, more so than others, and perhaps also at least within the age of time that we are living. But they have been subjects that have been trying to be worked out by very brilliant people through thousands and thousands of years. And so hopefully I can springboard off of their work and try to present these ideas in a way that can help make sense to us and bring us a little closer to understanding what our ancient fathers understood. So with that said, I want to begin with the idea of divine governance. So what do I mean by divine governance? Well, I'm speaking directly about the meaning behind the number 12, okay? This number, in my opinion, is a direct link that connects the biblical narrative to the principles of the Zodiac, right? Since, obviously, there are 12 tribes of Israel in the Bible. We all know that there's 12 disciples. And then, of course, there's the 12 signs of the Zodiac. So there's one for every month of the year. However, there is more that connects these three than just the number 12, okay? And that is that each of the 12 categories seems to represent a type or a characteristic or a persona, right? Some sort of a trait. And interestingly, the tribes, the disciples, and the Zodiac each align and foreshadow each other's types. So basically, you can find the same general descriptions in all three of them, all right, general descriptions. So here's just one example. And it proves that these ideas are somewhat interconnected. Now, the idea of divine governance would be to understand that each type, okay, each one of the 12 types is needed with the integration of the other 11 to create a full divine understanding. In other words, each type needs to appropriately counter and be countered by the opposing trait. And this would be for the sake of balancing and harmonizing all types, okay? Preventing any one of them, let's say, from overinflating. And this again would be the idea of what we spoke of before about the giants or the Nephilim, right? They're oversized, but then they're clumsy. And therefore, if you have each trait countering one another, the sum, which is found within the integration of all 12, is what is held within the center. Okay? And this is a whole other perspective that is indescribable. Okay, this thing that's in the center. It's a whole other perspective, and it's indescribable without the collection, right? Without the amalgamation or the melding together of all the other perspectives, working in unison, and all at the same given time. So if you think about that, that's kind of mind-blowing. And this is how we end up with that all-seeing eye, right? Or the eye of providence, which we see on our dollar bills. But this also explains the cherubim in Ezekiel's vision, right? The wheel that's full of eyes, okay? And so what I've been trying to lay out within this particular series of lectures is that we all likely favor one of those 12 types. But what we must realize at the same time, if we are to work towards that divine understanding, like enlightenment, right? We have to give ourselves to the light, just like the morning star gives itself to the rising sun. This way, we see not just in part, but rather that we can fully see. Okay? Therefore, the end goal is to grow and to awaken and to integrate with each other, with each type. So when we do this, we're not falling the idea is that we don't fall into the idol of one of them, right? We don't fall into idolatry, but instead, as Jung would say, we then become a whole individual. Therefore, as the principal idea goes, just as the sun circles and makes its way through the constellations, right? Enveloping and integrating each of their 12 natures into the fullness of its light, it was thought that each of the 12 disciples acted in the same way as the constellations. And Christ would then be at the head of the table, right? He would take the place of the sun in that general sense, enveloping and integrating each of the disciples' natures within himself, revealing all 12, resonating as a singular, perfected, whole being. And this is why, if anyone's familiar with Jung's work in the book of Ion, which is a crazy book, Jung refers to Christ as the symbol for the self. So he is the far-off resonance, if you think about it, of the original atom. Okay, that's Christ is the far-off resonance of the original atom, the singular and the fully integrated conscious, devoid then of indifference and devoid of sin. Now, remember at one point in the past, I used an example of a 12-string guitar to try to make this point, all right? And Christ would then represent that, the resonance of those 12 strings being strummed at the same time. So I thought that visual is kind of helpful for us to imagine what the 12 coming together would be like. So this is the general idea, but I know that, now I should say we're going to try to sink into this idea just a little bit deeper so we can try to understand this on a more psychological level and where we can bring it in closer and where we can try to bring it into our own sort of reality, right? So to do so, we're going to use shapes, okay? Particularly the circle and the square, okay? Or in this case, we're actually going to use the cube also. So we're actually going to be learning just a little bit about sacred geometry in this process. But hopefully by using the visuals, using these shapes, it will help us make a little bit more sense out of how all this comes together. So we begin with the circle and the square, two very basic shapes, okay? And in the ancient world, the circle was known to represent the heavens, and the square, of course, was to represent the earth. Now, this makes sense because we're used to seeing the astrological chart in a circle, okay? It's always put in a circle. The circle is always associated with that cosmic wheel. Since we have already discovered it reveals this continuous pattern, this rise, this fall, death, birth, beginning, end, sleep, awake, things like that. It's always going around. It's always continuing this recurring pattern. So the most obvious way to see the circle of heavenly patterns is to, as let's say it's coming down and breaking down into the earth, into physical reality. So you're bringing the heavens into the earth, is to see how these cycles kind of like break down and form our 4 seasons, okay? And this would be shown as the winter, which we could say represents somewhat the unconscious, death in some sense, to springtime, or then the springing up to life, the period of birth and awakening, to the vibrancy of summer, the fullness of life, and then the fall, which would be the process of falling back into winter again. And this is how we can take that rotational pattern, right? That continuous circle that goes around that we experience every year, but we categorize it into 4 separate points, okay? Essentially now turning the circle into a square, okay? Now we have 4 points, which transfers into 4 pillars, which then allows for a horizontal plane, okay? A dimension, a structure, a canvas, however you want to imagine it, right? And this is where material reality can exist within some sense of stability and actuality. So basically, where the embodiment of heaven can begin to anchor itself into a natural or physical reality. So let's see how we can integrate the 12 types into this geometric example. If we give our square some dimension, okay, now we turn it from a square and into a cube. And if we look at the cube, we can see that there are 12 separate edges that hold the entire shape together. So here's our 12 tribes, right? Our 12 disciples, and then, of course, the Zodiac. These are the types. And if we take notice to each corner where each line intercepts, we find the total of 8 different points. Okay? Now, this should give us a visual understanding of the 8 spokes of the cosmic wheel. And as I had pointed out in the past, the 8 spokes that makes up the architecture of our ceiling, right? So as I pointed out in the Toledot of Shem, the generations of Shem, there were 8 descendants within that genealogical wheel. And then there was that strange inference of the 9th descendant, which appeared to be the central hub of the wheel because it seemed to represent the end and the beginning at the same time. It's a centralized hub because it acts as a cosmic pole, where a circulating pattern has the ability to spiral upwards and go into that higher dimension or go into a higher state of being, right? And we use the example of a spiral staircase to make this point. I also believe that we can say that the space on the inside of our cube is in some sense acting as the same as that 9th point, it's because it's that space inside holds that collective identity of all of those outer points in some sense coming together. So I know I'm kind of moving quick on this, I'm sorry, but hopefully I'm not losing anyone. I know it's kind of complicated, but I'm gonna try and simplify this again if I can. The number 8, so far as I can tell, can be understood almost in the same sense as the number 12, all right? At least in the sense that it represents a recurring phase or a cycle, okay? Just perhaps at a different level. Like one might be happening at an individual level, which would be the 8, and then the 12 might be more of like a collective type level. But this is why the number 8 is that symbol of infinity, right? It's always going around, keeps going around. And our 9th, or that center, represents Christ. He kind of represents that hub that holds it all together. This is the 9th spoke also that's in the center of our light, by the way, if you remember me pointing that out. And this is in some sense represented by Christ's death also, which happened at, yes, as the Bible says, the 9th hour. So now speaking of death, this is where it does get a little bit tricky, okay? When all these types are rotating around the outside, this is the number 8 and the number 12, when they collapse inwards, so they all kind of like come in towards the center, and maybe a good way to imagine this is like water going down a drain, right? Or a black hole or something like that, okay? They all merge together into a singular resonance, which is what we were pointing out earlier. This again is that image of Christ, or psychologically speaking, what Jung would have referred to as the self. This is that oneness or wholeness that becomes something wholly other than each individual type. But yet, it's made of each type at the same time. It's all nested in there. And this is emphasized by Christ's death because when he died, as we are told, he went into hell to save those who were separate from God, right? So it is as if he enters into that central hub, or that space. And he's acting like the resonance of all the indifference between us. He's acting like that glue that holds all these types together. So Christ reconciles the sin and the indifference that would then be formed in between us. Perhaps the most simple way to explain this is to imagine that we're tuning the strings of that guitar, right? Because otherwise each string remains in some sense its own unique tone, but they must be balanced to a proper tuning. That is, if of course we want to harmonize with the other 11, right? We want all 12 to harmonize. And thus together they become a sound, of course, more brilliant than what they would have been on their own. So this act of tuning is what we could refer to as squaring the circle, right? We're taking individualized components, which could be acting on their own, which on their own could, of course, become chaos very fast, all right? Especially if each string is like out of tune. And we're tuning each possibility with the next one, and therefore making unity out of multiplicity. Okay, that's love. We're making order out of chaos. That's what love is. So as far as our square and our circle is concerned, you could imagine that the circle representing the zodiac, circling around the heavens, this is that vast, endless plethora of possibilities and types swirling around each other. And when we bring this into our psychology, this would then represent our unconscious. Okay? All the characteristics, each type, as they spontaneously flow in and out of our psyche. And because we can't be all things all at once, the unconscious then acts like a vast darkness, like a vast dark abyss. It's an ocean without a shoreline in some sense, right? And therefore, it's completely unknowable in itself. The square, on the other hand, represents consciousness as it momentarily anchors into physical reality, settling within an individual person. Okay? And this is what we call the ego. The ego is the point, the particle in the wave, the island in the midst of the ocean, and it allows for that endless flow of psyche to come into form. Now, this is squaring off consciousness. This squaring off of consciousness, I should say, is not random, nor is it meaningless, okay? It doesn't just happen for the sake of happening. And we know this because within our human condition, we have these profound experiences when suddenly the pieces come together, right? They come together like they should. And then there's this miraculous harmony that appears in front of us. And for that moment, we're captured by it. It captures us. And we call it beautiful, right? You can imagine all the pieces coming together, and then beauty just emerges suddenly. Beauty shows us that there is something hidden in that vast ocean of possibility. That things are not supposed to be arbitrary. They're not meaningless. They're not random. But there within, there is a probable design. And beauty shows us that design. Beauty shows us the way. And it is this particular reality, this particular truth, which is that the conscious flow is what conscious flow is always trying so desperately to manifest and make real, right? So all of the dots here within are all these points, right? In some way, they're trying to grab the potential of the circle and then place them into a form of being, into a form of order. So they're grabbing all the potential, which appears as pure randomness, and the points draw this potential together in a way that beauty can suddenly appear. Therefore, making beauty the evidence that all things, or all reality, is not random, but hidden within each thing is it has a proper place. Each thing has a proper place. And thus there's evidence of a perfect and beautiful design. The proper squaring of the circular potential, right? This is in some sense the womb of Mary. And this is how reality comes into existence. And biblically speaking, is why the New Jerusalem, which is spoken about in Revelation, which is the city of heaven, is said to be a perfect square. And we can read this in Revelations verses 21, 15 through 27, because in there it says that the city lies foursquare. Okay, so it says it lies foursquare, and it's measured with a golden rod, which of course we can imagine as stability, order. You know, the staff, the rod would mean that. But the measurements, of course, being 12,000 stadia. And it continues to say that its length and its breadth and its height are equal to each other. Okay? So a perfectly formed square and measured to perfection. Okay? Also has 12 gates, by the way. So how do we bring this down into our own human reality? Okay? Into our own into our own psychology. And thus, how do we bring heaven to earth? Well, first, we have to visualize our type, okay? In other words, which of the 12 do you represent? Then you must come to the realization that the other 11 are lying dormant somewhere within your unconscious. Somewhere within you is the whole self. Somewhere within you is the original Adam, and thus, of course, the image of Christ. This is the harmonization of all types, without the conflict, without friction. This is the resonance, and what we would consider then, of course, as the Holy Spirit. This is the Holy Spirit because, we know in Scripture, though they all spoke different languages, they yet knew they could understand each other perfectly, right? Even as we remain unique in our own type, we understand and resonate with each other. And so to begin this process, okay, we pulled down the 12 types from heaven. And just as we anchored the 12 months of the year into 4 seasons, the winter, spring, summer, and fall, we can anchor the 12 types into 4 psychological traits. And these traits, and this is of course according to the work of Jung, would be categorized as thinking, which would be our objective logic, feeling, which would be our subjective emotions, sensation, this is the way we use our 5 senses in the physical world, okay? And intuition, which perceives reality unconsciously, so it grabs unseen or hidden patterns that are not necessarily objectively apparent to us. But it is by these 4 psychic pillars that we have the foundation for what has built our personality tests even to this modern day. And by making use of them, we can now simplify our cube, right, and turn it back into that 4-point square. And if you take notice of these 4 points, 2 of them are structured more rigid and objectively. These are both thinking and sensation, while the other 2 are more fluid and subjective by nature, these being feeling and intuition. And so this means that we can split these 4 into 2 distinct categories, reducing them even further. And that's how we end up getting the serpent and the tree, right? We can call one side logos, and we can call the other side spirit or emotion. The cosmic representation of these 2 categories would then, of course, be heaven and earth. The human aspect, of course, would then be male and female, or the masculine and the feminine. And even a step further, each of us individually are neurologically split the same way, meaning the way our brains actually function. So in other words, we have 2 separate functioning hemispheres in our brain, the right side and the left side, right? The left side being the hemisphere that organizes, structures our logic into understanding, and the right hemisphere, which is more instinctual, more intuitive, and is grabbing the unknown or unconscious patterns. So between these hemispheres is what we call the corpus callosum, okay? And this is the part of the brain that actually acts as a bridge between 2 sides, allowing for both hemispheres to intercommunicate and harmonize. Otherwise, they do work independently, completely independently of each other. You can literally cut and separate one side of the brain from the other, and you will only be functioning from one side of the brain. So they completely work independently. So our brains are actually designed as logos on the left spirit on the right, which makes us walking epicenters for bringing heaven to earth. In other words, we as human beings are essentially the corpus callosum, which stands between what is divine and what can be understood as material reality. Okay? We, in some sense, are actively squaring the circle. Okay? Trying to pull down and manifest heavenly reality into earthly reality. Now, if we take the idea of the corpus callosum, and if we see it as a bridge connecting opposite natures, then we can say that this abridgment acts in a biological way as what we represent within our own moral practice of marriage. Okay, in other words, the sacred marriage, or the hieros gamos, hopefully I'm saying that right, reveals the mystery of submitting oneself for the sake of uniting together. And this is the great work of making two into one. And that such an effort between husband and wife is in some strange sense relatable to the interaction between the two opposing hemispheres, making two flesh work together as one flesh, right? Therefore, within a marriage, the relationship between two individuals is often successful, usually when both are willing to serve a purpose higher than themselves. This third entity, well, it could be the marriage, but it's often found also within our children, right? That fruit of togetherness, of what we make by coming together. And so to bring this back into the spiritual world, the scripture confirms marriage as this magical key, as Christ had spoken of himself in Mark 29:19 as the bridegroom. And then this was more clearly laid out by St. Paul in Ephesians 5:31 through 32, which I'll read, when he states, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." This mystery is a profound one, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. So this imagery again reveals the church as the multiple, right? Being brought into a form of unity with Christ. And this returns us to the idea again of divine governance, since the word church is derived from the Greek, referring to those who assemble together. So again, the key is found within the magic of assembly, okay? Where the multiple come together for a unified purpose, something beyond each individual, but found within that collective effort. And so we may ask ourselves, what does this process of unifying together actually look like? What is a practical way in which we can understand how to unite the two opposing natures into one? And how can we discover what Jung called the coincidence of opposites? The middle way, okay? And that is despite the indifference that is held between us. Well, again, we come to the next verse, which is spoken by St. Paul as he finishes on the nature of marriage, and this is Ephesians 5:33. "Let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband." Strange verse, but this is where we're going to try to break that down a little bit to make it understood. This is where it gets a little bit tricky, because in today's world, okay, we don't like to categorize men and women in any kind of particular roles. However, to understand this point, what the scripture is trying to say, it is helpful for us to put on our spiritual glasses, okay? And then when we put these glasses on, we can see how the husband here is representing logos or representing logic. And we can understand how the wife is representing spirit or emotion, okay? So when the spirit of the feminine rises up, and oftentimes with empathy, sometimes with transformity, she looks to protect or encourage the enthusiasm of the creative spirit, or we could say the spirit of the child, okay? Since she is, of course, the bearer of children. Thus, the feminine is wired to be more fluid by nature. The husband, on the other hand, is often more rigid. He is wired to protect. He is called to keep things in order so that there's less vulnerability and therefore less opportunity for danger. So as Paul is pointing out, right, the husband must forfeit his rigor, right, his structure, at least in part, for the freedom and the growth of the creative enterprise. In other words, the spirit and potential of a child, so that the spirit and potential of a child is not lost, okay? And the wife, in reciprocation, right, must respect the boundaries of the husband, allowing that spirit of enthusiasm to flow freely, but within his walls, not to venture too far, of course, into the wilderness, because if it goes too far into the wilderness, all is lost, right? Now, the psychological aspect of this is rooted in our own neurochemistry. So, branching off of what I've already pointed out here, the left hemisphere of the brain could be understood as the husband or logos or logic, and the right hemisphere would then be the spirit or the wife, right? So you could imagine that anytime our emotions rise up, they act like an internal radar system, sending out signals anytime our unconscious senses something good or bad, right? But it's not always clear what that sensation is trying to tell us, what the feelings are trying to tell us, okay? It can lead us to something good, but it can, of course, lead us to something bad. So in order to understand what exactly is happening, our emotions must jump over to that left hemisphere, and they must be aligned with the objective truth of a situation. So the feelings must be then defined. They must be understood and also then, of course, validated. Otherwise, they'll just keep swirling around in that state of confusion, excitement, fear, anxiety, basically chaos. And thus, a neurosis, right, which would be the internal conflict of the mind, what Jung called an internal conflict of the mind, could almost be understood like a marital battle, but within our own psyche, okay? So these are the great warring halves, the left and the right. They're always in a struggle for peace of mind, okay? And so to conclude the psychology of the zodiac, we began looking to the heavens, right? Looking to these 12 types. And we have come to know that the stars tell us a story of 12 distinct energies, okay? 12 different ways of being, 12 different ways of feeling and perceiving. Thus, just like the 12 tribes and the 12 disciples, these constellations represent the sprawling and the fluid diversity within the flow of consciousness and unconsciousness. However, the psychology of the zodiac, in my opinion, at least, it is not meant for us to rest within any type necessarily, but it acts as a map for the psychological and spiritual integration. We can say that the heavens move in a great circle, representing the infinite, the spiritual, and what is fluid. But within our material reality, we live upon a four-square earth. This is the place of solid matter, where we are confined to biology and therefore, in some sense, an unforgivable rigor and logic at times. So the great mystery of our lives is the holy marriage between these two realities, the effort of bringing heaven down to earth, and thus we are called to act within a transformative geometry where we are called to circle our square, or circle our ego conscious. This is Israel circling the square city of Jericho until the walls fell down, right? This is the priest always being subject to the prophet. This is Aaron who had to give way to Moses. And therefore, this is the wrestling of the mind, just as Israel is known to wrestle with God. It becomes the purification of marriage, where two distinct natures submit themselves to one another. And they create a singular, a resonant life. This is the way, the truth, and the life. This is the principle of Christ, acting like a bridge. And by understanding his death and resurrection, Christ grants us the most profound revelation, the truth that by giving ourselves to one another, we may lose ourselves, but only to find ourselves, our true higher selves. And this reveals to us what is hard and what is fluid. They are not enemies, but rather they are the two hands of the same God. So within this admixture, within the coincidence of opposites, this is where we will find the holy resonance. We will find the life that is truly life, and you will find the city of heaven, right? The perfect square, but adorned with all 12 golden gates. And this will be the place where God and man are finally forever one. Thank you all, and God bless.